My name is Claire Pierce. I'm 32, and for most of my life, I've been the family's emergency contact, unpaid accountant, and emotional shock absorber. If my mom could sum me up in one word, it would be responsible. If I could sum up my family in one word, it would be expensive. I work as an operations manager for an international logistics company. Shipments, spreadsheets, deadlines. Before we get to the dinner that ended it all, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every comment, and I'd love to know who's part of our community tonight. The Sapphire Room was designed to make you feel important, but mostly it just made you feel suffocated. It was a private dining suite in the back of the city's most pretentious hotel, draped in blue velvet curtains that smelled of old dust and expensive lilies. My parents, James and Angela, had insisted on this specific venue for their 30th wedding anniversary. They wanted intimacy, they said. What they really wanted was a captive audience. I had arrived 20 minutes early to ensure the table settings were correct and, more importantly, to settle the bill in advance. $1,200. That was the price of admission for the evening. I handed my credit card to the maitre d' with the same mechanical detachment I used when approving a shipping manifest. There was no joy in the transaction, only the dull satisfaction of a completed task. When my family arrived, they swept in like a hurricane of chaos and cologne. My older brother Zachary was wearing a suit that cost more than his car financed, no doubt, by his latest failed startup idea. My younger brother Logan, the eternal student at 26, looked disheveled but charming the way only the baby of the family is allowed to be. And then there were my parents. Angela didn't just walk into a room. She held court. She kissed Zachary on both cheeks, cooed over Logan's hair, and then handed me her coat without making eye contact. "Check the wine list, would you, Claire?" she said, settling into the head of the table. "Zachary deserves a good red after his big week. He's closing in on a major deal." I knew for a fact Zachary wasn't closing a deal. He was closing a bankruptcy filing. I had paid his legal retainer 3 days ago. But I didn't say that. I just opened the menu. For the next hour, I sat in silence, eating a steak I had paid for, listening to my parents construct a fantasy world where their sons were titans of industry and I was merely the help. Across the candlelight, my mother's gaze lingered on Zachary with a desperate sort of adoration. For years I had categorized her cruelty as simple favoritism, but sitting there watching her ignore the daughter who funded her lifestyle to praise the son who drained it, I realized it was something deeper. It was a defense mechanism. My stability shone a harsh, unforgiving light on her son's failures. Every time I fixed a problem, every time I paid a bill they couldn't, I was inadvertently proving that her golden children were incompetent. She didn't attack me because I was bad. She attacked me because my competence collapsed her false reality. I was the mirror she wanted to shatter. The dinner wound down, and the waiter poured the champagne for the toasts. James stood up first, mumbling something about 30 years of patience, but it was Angela who commanded the room. She stood, raising her glass, the diamonds on her wrist, catching the light diamonds I had insured. "To my boys," she said, her voice trembling with performance. "Zachary, for your vision. Logan, for your heart. You are the spirit of this family." She took a sip, then turned her gaze to me. The warmth vanished from her eyes, replaced by a cold, pitying smile. "And Claire," she continued, loud enough for the servers to hear, "thank you for handling the logistics tonight. It is a shame you are too transactional to understand what real love looks like, but we do appreciate the check." The room went dead silent. The air conditioner hummed. Zachary smirked into his glass. I looked at my mother, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to cry. I felt the click of a lock engaging. The contract was over. There was no emotional outburst, no scene. I simply opened my laptop, signaled the waiter with a raised finger, and started clicking cancel. The interface was familiar, comforting even. Cancel standing order. Confirm. Cancel autopay. Confirm. It took exactly 45 seconds to dismantle the financial infrastructure I had spent 3 years building for them. "Ma'am," the waiter asked, hovering nervously by my shoulder. "Cancel the prepayment on my card," I said, my voice steady, professional. "And bring the check to the table. Just drop it in the center." I closed my laptop with a soft snap. My mother was still smiling, that cold, pitying smile, waiting for me to react, to beg to apologize for being so transactional. She expected tears. She expected a scene. She didn't expect silence. When the waiter returned, he placed the black leather folder in the middle of the crisp white tablecloth. It sat there like a landmine. I picked it up, opened it, and glanced at the total. $1,242. I pulled the itemized receipt out, folded it neatly, and placed it back on the table. "Perfect," I said, looking directly at my mother. "Then don't ask me for any more money." I stood up, smoothed my dress, and picked up my purse. I didn't look back. I walked out of the sapphire room, down the plush hallway, and into the cool night air. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and silence. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was racing, cataloging the ledger of my own stupidity. It wasn't just the dinner. It was the $32,000 I had wired to cover my father's bad investment 2 years ago, money he swore was a loan, money I never saw again. It was the $3,500 that left my account on the first of every month to pay the mortgage on their 4-bedroom colonial in the suburbs, a house they insisted they couldn't downsize from because it held too many memories. It was the bailouts for Zachary's failed businesses and Logan's tuition for degrees he never finished. I had been a gambler at a slot machine, feeding coins into a game that was rigged against me. I realized with a sick clarity that I had stayed and paid for so long, not because I was generous, but because I was terrified. I had invested so much emotionally and financially that walking away felt like admitting defeat. I had been waiting for the jackpot of their love, convinced that if I just put in one more coin, one more check, one more bailout, the lights would flash and they would finally see me. But the machine was broken. It had always been broken. And tonight I had finally stopped playing. The aftermath wasn't quiet. It was a symphony of gaslighting. By the time I reached my apartment, my phone was vibrating so hard it was dancing across the passenger seat. First, my father, you humiliated your mother on her big night. I have never been more disappointed. Call us immediately and fix this. Then, Zachary, seriously, Claire, we can't afford that bill. You know that. Why are you being so selfish? It's Mom's anniversary. Then a notification from Facebook. My mother had posted a status update vague enough to be deniable but specific enough to be lethal. Sharp is the tooth of an ungrateful child. Prayers for my daughter who has lost her way. Sometimes money changes people, and not for the better. I stared at the screen, the blue light illuminating my dark living room. They weren't sorry. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about the bill. They were worried about the narrative. I switched modes. The hurt daughter was gone. The operations manager was in charge. I sat at my desk, the one organized with the same precision I used at work, and opened a new spreadsheet. I titled it Severance. I didn't argue. I didn't engage. I executed. The utility companies were first on the list. My name was on the accounts for their house because my credit score was more reliable. I requested immediate removal of service liability effective the next billing cycle. Next, I logged into my bank. I didn't just cancel payments. I froze the joint account I had set up for emergencies, an account they had drained 3 times in the last year for non-emergencies like country club dues and networking dinners. Then I drafted an email, not to my family but to my lawyer, Julia. She was an old friend, a shark in a silk blouse who specialized in forensic accounting. Julia, I need to separate my finances completely from my parents. I want a full audit. I want to know exactly what my liability is if they default on the mortgage. I want out. I hit send. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. The silence in my apartment was heavy, but for the first time in years, it wasn't lonely. It was clean. 2 days later, Julia called. She didn't use her friend voice. She used her litigator voice, the one that sounded like a serrated knife wrapped in silk. Claire, she said, I need you to come to my office. Now. Bring the mortgage statements. I sat in her glass-walled conference room an hour later, staring at a document she had slid across the mahogany table. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a photocopy of a public filing from the county clerk's office. I ran a standard title search, Julia said, tapping the paper with a manicured nail. Just to see how your name was listed on the lien, to make sure we could extricate you cleanly. And I found this. It was a quitclaim deed. I scanned the legalese, my eyes catching the essential data points. Grantors James and Angela Pierce. Grantees Zachary Pierce and Logan Pierce. Date of filing October 14th. That's 2 weeks ago, I said, my voice flat. 2 weeks before the anniversary dinner. Julia nodded, her expression grim. They transferred the ownership of the house to your brothers. But they left the mortgage in your father's name, knowing your standing order was the only thing keeping it current. I sat back, the air leaving my lungs in a slow, controlled exhale. It wasn't just favoritism. It wasn't just a lack of gratitude. It was a long con. They had secured the asset for their golden children while leaving me tethered to the liability. They intended to let me pay off the remaining $300,000 on a property that I would never inherit, never own, and never benefit from. They had orchestrated the transfer, then sat at that dinner table, drank the wine I bought, and toasted to my transactional nature, all while holding the secret that they had already stolen my future to fund my brother's inheritance. It wasn't family drama anymore. It was financial fraud. "What does this mean for the mortgage?" I asked. "It means," Julia said, a shark-like grin touching her lips, "that the bank doesn't know. Most mortgages have a due on sale clause. Transferring the title without the lender's permission usually triggers an immediate demand for full repayment." I looked at the document again. The signatures were crisp. My parents had signed away their home to my brothers, assuming I would be the silent, stupid machinery that kept the lights on. "They think I'm still the safety net," I said. "They think you're the mark," Julia corrected. I stood up. I didn't feel angry. Anger is hot. It burns out. This was cold. This was absolute zero. "Draft the letter," I told her. "But don't send it to the bank yet. I want to deliver the news myself." 3 weeks later, the bank sent the delinquency notice. It arrived at their house, not mine, but the digital alert pinged my phone because my email was still linked to the mortgage portal as a courtesy contact. Payment past due. Foreclosure proceedings imminent. I didn't forward it. I didn't call. I waited. They showed up on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting on my beige linen sofa, reading a book in a room that was perfectly silent, perfectly clean, and perfectly mine. The doorman had called up to say my family was in the lobby. "Send them up," I said, "but don't let them in the elevator without an escort." When I opened the door, they looked like refugees from a lifestyle they could no longer afford. Angela's hair was slightly unkempt, her signature blowout deflated. James looked older, his face gray and slack. Zachary and Logan stood behind them, shifting their weight, looking at the floor, looking at the ceiling, looking anywhere but at me. "We need to talk," James said, trying to summon the voice of the patriarch, but it cracked. "The bank called. They're threatening to take the house." "I know," I said. "I didn't invite them in." I stood in the doorway, a physical barrier between my peace and their chaos. "You can't let this happen, Claire," Angela pleaded, stepping forward. Her eyes were rimmed with red, but I recognized the performance. It was the victim-mother routine, Act 3. "That house is our legacy. It's where we raised you. How can you be so cold? We're going to be on the street." "You stopped paying," Zachary chimed in, finding his courage now that his inheritance was threatened. "You can't just stop paying a mortgage you agreed to pay. That's negligence." I looked at Zachary. He was wearing a new watch. Not an Omega, but flashy enough to cover a mortgage payment. "I didn't stop paying my mortgage," I said softly. I reached for the manila folder sitting on the entryway table. I had prepared it the day after my meeting with Julia. I held it out to my father. "What is this?" he asked, taking it warily. "It's a copy of the quitclaim deed you filed last month," I said. The air left the hallway. Angela went rigid. Zachary stopped shifting. Logan finally looked at me, his eyes wide with the realization that the game was up. "You transferred the title to Zachary and Logan," I continued, my voice flat, precise, and entirely void of sympathy. "You legally severed your ownership of the property. And since I was only paying the mortgage to assist you, my parents, my obligation ended the moment you signed that paper." "Claire, listen," James started sweating now. "We were just trying to protect the asset." "You were trying to secure the asset for them while keeping the liability with me," I corrected. "You wanted me to pay off a house I would never own." I looked at my brothers. "Congratulations, boys," I said. "You're homeowners. That means the foreclosure is your problem. It's your asset. It's your debt. I suggest you get jobs." "We can't pay that," Logan shouted, his voice cracking into a whine. "I'm still in grad school." "Then sell it," I said. "Or lose it. It has nothing to do with me." Angela lunged forward, grabbing my arm. "You are destroying this family, over money, over a dinner bill. Have you no shame?" I looked at her hand on my arm. Then I looked into her eyes. There was no love there, just panic. Just the terrifying realization that the host had detached and the parasites were starving. "I didn't destroy anything," I said, removing her hand from my sleeve. "I just turned on the lights." I stepped back and closed the door. I threw the deadbolt. It was the loudest sound in the world. The fallout wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It was the sound of a balloon slowly losing air until it's just a wrinkled piece of plastic on the floor. Without my monthly infusion of $3,500, the mortgage went unpaid. The bank, unlike me, didn't accept guilt trips or family loyalty as currency. The foreclosure proceeded with brutal efficiency. The house, the 4-bedroom colonial filled with too many memories, was sold at auction 6 months later. My parents didn't end up on the street. They ended up in a 2-bedroom rental on the other side of town, a place with thin walls and laminate countertops. It was perfectly adequate. It was what they could afford. Zachary and Logan stopped visiting them. Once the inheritance evaporated, once the house was gone and there was no asset left to fight over, their devotion evaporated with it. Zachary moved to another state to pursue a new venture, which I assumed meant finding someone else to fund his delusions. Logan moved in with a girlfriend and stopped answering their calls. It turned out I wasn't the problem. I was the glue. I was the artificial gravity holding their dysfunctional little planet together. The moment I removed myself, they floated apart into the cold, empty vacuum of their own selfishness. As for me, I'm sitting on my beige linen sofa on a quiet Tuesday morning. The sun is streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. My phone is silent. My bank account is healthy. My calendar is open. I used to think that walking away would break me. I thought the silence would be unbearable, that the guilt would eat me alive. But the truth is, the silence isn't empty. It's full. It's full of peace. It's full of the realization that I am not an appliance. I am not a utility. I am a person. I opened my laptop, but not to pay a bill. I opened it to book a flight. Paris. 2 weeks. Solo. This wasn't revenge. Revenge implies I wanted to hurt them. I didn't want to hurt them. I just wanted to stop hurting myself. If you've ever felt like the invisible one, the one whose value is measured only in what you can provide, I want you to know something. You are allowed to resign. You are allowed to close the account. You are allowed to be transactional if the only transaction they offer is exploitation. So tell me in the comments, have you ever had to fire your own family? What was the moment you knew it was over? I'll be reading every single story. Because we aren't alone. We're just finally free.